Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Wisdom Wednesday. My name's Mark Florka. I am Bakerpedia's Baked in Science podcast host and baking instructor. And today on Wisdom Wednesday, I want to talk to you a little bit about shelf time analysis or measurements, if you will, right? We hear a lot about shelf life expectancy, and there's a lot of things, of course, related around mold. And I'm not going to talk to you today about mold and sanitation and things like that. But the other part of shelf life is texture, moisture, staling, softness, that type of thing. And for this, there's a lot of different methods that you can use to measure what you are achieving. So to do that, you have to, of course, have a control standard that you are baking. Say it is a standard loaf of white bread that you're making, or a cookie, or a high ratio cake. So one of those things. And then what you want to do is make these and then have them packaged and sit at room temperature for the desired period of time that you're going to be evaluating. Accelerated shelf life can be done in a chamber that is set to typically what is used is 40 degrees Celsius with about 85 to 90% humidity. And in that case, on average, a 1 week equals 1 month is sort of the rule of thumb. There's no purely scientific evaluation of this other than to compare with the standard aging, but it gives you a good approximation when it comes to things that are susceptible to heat and stuff. So mostly for some of the bacteria growth, or in things like bars where you're going to get the sugar recrystallizing. It doesn't work very well for things like breads and cakes. It will work well for cookies, as for cookies we're often looking at either them staying hard or staying soft. But so let's just talk about standard ambient temperature shelf life. So we've made our cake, our bread, our cookie, and packaged it, and now we've left it on the shelf. So when it comes up to evaluating this, we want to decide ahead of time what intervals are we going to evaluate at. It might be days, it might be weeks. In the cases of like a white bread, I would probably say you want to evaluate on 1 day after baking, then maybe 3, then maybe 7 and 10, for example, right? Maybe even 14 if you want to go that far. And so that meaning, so if you have 1, 3, 7, and 10, that means you have to have at least 4 loaves of bread baked to be able to compare them over time. And then you have to, if you want to have, of course, the fresh one. Now, if you want to do comparatives at each interval, you will have to bake a fresh comparison at each time. So you will have to bake a fresh one on day 1, a fresh one on day 3, on day 7, on day 10, and day 14, if you will. So then you have a fresh one compared to the 14-day-old one, for example. And so there's a lot of things you can do. So one of the things we talk about in perception of freshness is moisture. A lot of times, moisture actually has little to do with the amount of water there, but you can measure this relatively easily, right? Ideally, you want to have something like a toaster oven that holds its temperature consistently, or you can use a regular oven as well. It's just, of course, heating up a whole oven for a small sample is not always the most economical thing. And what you want to do is you want to take a sample of bread, for example, and you would take about 10 grams of bread. And you would measure this bread and take more than one sample, so from different parts of the loaf and things like that, and put it into small metal containers that you can put into the oven. And so you number them, you weigh them all what they are before you put them in the oven. So you don't have to be exactly 10 grams, as long as you just a reasonable sample size, right? Something like 10 grams a piece. break them up just a little bit, and then you put them in the toaster oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly around 95 Celsius, something like that. And you want to leave them there for 20 minutes. And after those 20 minutes, you take them out of the oven and you wait again another 20 minutes. And then you weigh them. Now you can see after that 20 minutes at 200 and 20 minutes of cooling, you will have a different weight. So you started off with something like 10 grams, you might have something like 9 grams afterwards, right? So that means that your bread had about 10% moisture in it. It's probably going to be higher than that, but I'm just using that as a simple example, right? So you can see, you calculate the difference of how much weight you lost from the fresh sample to the completed dry sample, and then calculate that as a ratio to the original weight, and you know in percentage what the moisture content is. So that is actual moisture content, right? You can do this with bread, cookie, cakes. That all works very well, right? And now the other one that we often talk about, especially when it comes to long shelf life of cookies, where we want to inhibit the potential for bacteria growth, is water activity. You'll see this denoted often on papers and such as a lowercase a with a small subscript W on it, or AW, right? Just general AWs becoming more and more accepted these days because it's harder to do these subscripts on telephones and smartphones and iPads and things like that. But anyway, so it's AW, active water. Some people also refer to this as free water. This means that water that is free, that is not bound, and it's available to bacteria to use for fermentation. So the way to measure this is by equipment, because you have to basically heat the sample and you have to measure how, at a very, very low temperature, it's being heated very gradually, and you have to measure how much water evaporates at these different temperatures, and that is done on a mirror in terms of how much it clouds the mirror and so on, right? So this is done with a piece of equipment that can be purchased. They're a little bit of upfront money, but if it's something like, if you're a cookie manufacturer who is basically doing a lot of R&D on new cookies for different clients, and where you need long shelf life for shipping and distribution and things like that, it's well worth the investment to purchase a machine. It only takes anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to get a result. So it's very quick, right? And it's very reliable too. It's very consistent. There is no easy shortcut way to measure water activity in that sense. You can presume certain things in terms of binding water by using humectants such as corn syrup, fructose, dextrose, sugar, glycerin, things like that will bind the water, right? And do not allow it to escape to be used for bacteria. And then one of the other ones that is commonly referred to is, and I wanted to step back to moisture, in that often what is perceived, because since if moisture is not always what is there, like in a cake, for example, what is moistness? Moisture is often a perception in terms of how it cleans off the palate and things like that. So in the case of cakes in particular, the perceived moistness is often fat. And as a matter of fact, it's usually fat in the form of liquid vegetable oil, whether that be sunflower oil or soybean or canola or corn or olive oil. It's that liquid portion of oil that is relatively low in saturated fat, and so it has a very fluid kind of perception of feeling on the tongue. So that is what we often also perceive as moistness, which is, and then of course together with that, the sugar that binds the water that is there. And so the last one I want to touch on is texture. This one you can kind of do, what we might call a MacGyver of it. But the best thing is to have texture analyzing equipment. This is equipment that is very sensitive. It can sense a less than a gram of pressure, so that then you can use it for very accurate measurements as to how firm your product is, and it will even calculate and measure things in terms of how resilient it is, how spongy it is, how gummy, and how sticky, because it can feel all these different things through multiple measurements and do some calculations for you. So failing that, because that is a bit more of an investment, but there again, if you're a larger cake manufacturer, and especially on the R&D side of things and checking your shelf life, you definitely want to have a texture analyzer to be able to measure these things. It's quick, it's easy to use, and it gives you very consistent and quantifiable results. The only other thing you could do is to, as I said, if you wanted to MacGyver something, is if you had something of a small, consistent weight that you could compare. Let's say if you had something that is relatively small, for maybe about yeah, 2 centimeters in diameter, or something like that, an inch and a half around there, and that is a solid weight. So something that maybe weighs 50 grams or 100 grams or something like that. And so you could then take this and you could measure, have the known height of this weight, this item, and the known height of your slices of bread or cake. And then you could place the weight on the cake and wait maybe for 20 or 30 seconds, and then measure that height now. And so then you can get a measurement as to how deep that 100-gram weight sank into the bread or the cake. Now, this is very rudimentary, but it would give you a comparison, so that if you did that on the fresh sample and did that on a sample that's like 7 days old or 14 days old, you can see the difference in firmness. Right? This does not tell you starch retrogradation, but it just tells you in terms of how firm the product is. Scaling is, again, something that would have to be done through analysis under a microscope to be able to see the recrystallization of the starches. Right? So I hope that is informative for you. And that's the Wisdom Wednesday for today. And we'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.